First signs. The medical bay of the Stellaris hummed with its usual crystalline resonance, a sound that typically brought comfort to Dr. Nixis during her daily rounds. Today, however, the peaceful atmosphere was shattered by the thunderous sound of human sneezing. By the void, what was that? Junior medic Tari's luminescent scales flickered in alarm, her four-fingered hand clutching her diagnostic tablet so tightly it threatened to crack. Engineer Jasper Harrison sat on the examination platform, looking rather sheepish as he wiped his nose with the back of his hand. His normally pale skin had taken on a peculiar flush that Dr. Nixis had never observed in her 3 years of studying human physiology. "Sorry about that," Jasper mumbled, his voice rougher than usual. "Just a cold, I think. Wouldn't have even come in, but the engineering chief insisted after I sneezed on the plasma manifold." Dr. Nixis approached cautiously, her sensor stalks extending to their full length as they analyzed the atmospheric composition around the human. The readings made her outer membrane ripple with concern. "Your body temperature has elevated by 2.1 degrees Celsius above your baseline, Engineer Harrison. Are you experiencing some form of thermal regulation failure?" Jasper chuckled, then winced as the motion triggered another cough. "No, document. It's just a fever. Pretty normal when humans get sick. Our bodies heat up to fight off infections." Tari's scales shifted to a worried purple. "Intentional hyperthermia? That seems extremely dangerous." She consulted her tablet, fingers dancing across the surface. "According to our database, an increase of even 1 degree can begin to denature proteins in most species. Human proteins are more heat-resistant," Jasper explained, then sneezed again. This time, both aliens took an instinctive step back. Sorry. Look, I just need some rest and maybe some of that synthesized chicken soup from the galley. I'll be fine in a few days." Dr. Nixis's sensor stalks whirred as they processed this information. In her centuries of medical practice across 17 different species, she had never encountered one that deliberately induced fever as a healing mechanism. She moved to the central diagnostic console, her appendages flowing gracefully across the controls. "Engineer Harrison, I must insist on a full bioscan. If your body is indeed intentionally generating excess heat, we need to understand the process and ensure it doesn't pose a risk to ship systems or other crew members." Jasper sighed but didn't protest as the scanning field enveloped him. The holographic display sprang to life, showing a detailed map of his body's thermal output. Dr. Nixis and Tari stared at the readings with a mixture of fascination and horror. "This is remarkable," Dr. Nixis murmured, her voice modulating with scientific interest. "Your hypothalamus is actively driving up your core temperature. And look at these immune system readings, Tari. The elevated temperature is accelerating white blood cell production and mobility." Tari's scales had shifted to the deep blue of intense concentration. "It's like a controlled burn, using heat to eliminate pathogens. But surely the energy cost must be enormous." "That's why we get tired and hungry when we're sick," Jasper explained, swaying slightly on the platform. "Our bodies are literally burning through resources to fight the infection." Dr. Nixis made a decision. "You will remain here for observation, Engineer Harrison. This is the first documented case of intentional therapeutic hyperthermia we've encountered in a sentient species. The medical implications are significant." "Doc, really, I just need to sleep it off." Jasper's protest was cut short by another explosive sneeze. "That is not a request," Dr. Nixis stated firmly, her sensor stalks rigid with authority. "Tari, prepare a containment field and begin monitoring vital signs at 30-second intervals. I want to understand exactly how this process progresses." As Tari hurried to comply, Jasper flopped back onto the examination platform with a groan. "You aliens are worse than my mother," he muttered, pulling his jacket tighter around himself as a shiver ran through his body. Dr. Nixis ignored the complaint, her attention focused on the streaming data. Humans had been part of the galactic community for less than a decade, and they continued to surprise her. A species that fought infection by essentially cooking it to death. The implications were fascinating. She needed to document this thoroughly. If this was indeed a normal human healing response, it would require significant updates to the ship's medical protocols. She began dictating notes as Jasper's temperature continued its deliberate climb, marking the beginning of what would prove to be a very educational experience for the Stellaris' medical team. The story continues in Part 2, where the alien medical team grapples with their understanding of human biology as Jasper's fever progresses. Rising temperature. 6 hours into the observation, the medical bay of the Stellaris had transformed into what could only be described as organized chaos. Holographic displays covered every available surface, each monitoring a different aspect of Jasper Harrison's increasingly concerning condition. Temperature now at 39.7 degrees Celsius, Tari announced, her scales cycling through worried shades of purple and green. That's nearly 4 degrees above his baseline, Dr. Nixis. The chief medical officer's sensor stalks word continuously as she processed the stream of data. Fascinating. The immune response continues to escalate, yet cellular degradation remains within acceptable parameters. She glided closer to Jasper's examination platform, where the engineer had bundled himself in thermal blankets despite his elevated temperature. Still just a fever, Doc, Jasper mumbled, his voice hoarse. Though I wouldn't say no to some water. Before Dr. Nixis could respond, the medical bay's doors slid open with a soft hiss. Lieutenant Rena Wade, another human crew member, strode in with purpose. Her dark eyes widened at the sight of all the monitoring equipment surrounding her colleague. I heard Jasper was sick, but this looks like a research facility, she said, taking in the scene. Don't you think this is a bit excessive? Dr. Nixis's outer membrane rippled with mild indignation. Lieutenant Wade, your crewmate is experiencing a severe autoimmune response that's raising his core temperature to potentially dangerous levels. This level of monitoring is entirely appropriate. Rena ran a hand through her short silver hair, fighting back a smile. Has anyone actually explained human fevers to you, Doctor? Engineer Harrison attempted to, but his explanation was incomplete, Dr. Nixis admitted. He simply stated it was normal and fine, which seems inadequate given the circumstances. Rena pulled up a holographic chair next to Jasper's platform. Okay, let me try. Humans have been dealing with fevers for our entire existence. Our bodies evolved this response because it works. The heat makes it harder for viruses and bacteria to reproduce, while helping our immune system work more efficiently. Tari's scales shifted to a curious blue as she added another set of readings to her tablet. But the energy expenditure must be enormous. We've recorded a 30% increase in metabolic rate. That's why we rest and hydrate, Rena explained, passing a water container to Jasper, who accepted it gratefully. Our bodies are literally burning through resources to fight the infection. It's like running a marathon while lying still. Dr. Nixis's sensor stalks twitched with interest. And this is sustainable. Within limits, Rena nodded. Most humans can handle fevers up to about 41 degrees Celsius before it becomes dangerous. Below that, it's uncomfortable but not life-threatening. A sudden alarm chirped from one of the monitoring stations. Tari rushed to check it, her scales paling. Doctor, his white blood cell count has nearly doubled in the last hour. That's supposed to happen, Jasper croaked from his cocoon of blankets. Means the fever's doing its job. Dr. Nixis moved to examine the readings herself, her membrane displaying patterns of scientific fascination. The coordination between thermal regulation and immune response is remarkable. Your species essentially creates a hostile environment within your own body to combat pathogens. Pretty metal, right? Jasper managed a weak grin. We're like walking autoclaves. I don't understand that reference, Tari admitted, but the principle is both terrifying and impressive. Lieutenant Wade stood, straightening her uniform. Just make sure he stays hydrated and gets rest. The fever will break on its own once it's done its job. And Dr. Nixis? The alien physician's sensor stalks turned toward her. Try not to dissect him in the name of science, okay? I would never. Dr. Nixis began, then noticed the human's teasing smile. Ah. You are employing humor to defuse tension. Noted. As Rena left, Dr. Nixis returned to her examination of the data streams. The more she studied this human fever response, the more questions she had. How had their species evolved such a precise control over their internal temperature? What other physiological surprises might humans be harboring? Tari, she called to her assistant, begin compiling a comparative analysis of known species' immune responses. I suspect we may need to revise several chapters in our xenobiology manuals. Yes, Doctor, Tari responded, her scales shifting to the deep blue of concentration. Should I also prepare a report for the Galactic Medical Council? This could have significant implications for multi-species medical protocols. Agreed. But first, Dr. Nixis turned to adjust the environmental controls around Jasper's platform. Let's ensure our patient's comfort while we conduct our observations. Jasper had dozed off, his breathing steady despite the occasional cough. The monitors continued their vigilant watch, recording every aspect of this uniquely human healing process. And in the quiet hum of the medical bay, two alien medical professionals found themselves developing a new appreciation for the resilience of their human colleagues. Breaking point. Doctor, his temperature has reached 40.2 degrees. Tari's scales had blanched to an alarming shade of white, her hands hovering uncertainly over the medical controls. Shouldn't we intervene? Dr. Nixis's sensor stalks were spinning rapidly, processing the cascade of data from Jasper's monitors. The human engineer lay on the examination platform, his skin flushed and glistening with sweat, occasional tremors running through his body despite the pile of blankets. Lieutenant Wade assured us this was within normal parameters, Dr. Nixis responded, though her outer membrane rippled with concern. However, her deliberation was interrupted by the medical bay doors sliding open. First Officer Zwaxtai strode in, his crystalline exoskeleton catching the light in sharp angles. Doctor, I've received reports about a potentially dangerous situation in your medical bay. Something about a human generating extreme heat. First Officer, Dr. Nixis acknowledged, her sensor stalk straightening respectfully. Yes, Engineer Harrison is experiencing what humans call a fever. It's apparently a normal immune response for their species. Zwaxtai's faceted eyes fixed on Jasper's prone form. Normal. He's radiating enough heat to register on the ship's thermal sensors. Engineering is concerned about potential damage to sensitive equipment. I assure you, Dr. Nixis began, but was cut off by a harsh cough from Jasper. Sorry to cause all this fuss, Jasper managed between coughs, his voice rough. But I promise, the ship's systems are safe. Human body heat isn't that powerful. The first officer's crystalline structure vibrated with skepticism. Doctor, as head of ship safety, I must insist on immediate intervention. We cannot risk. Begging your pardon, sir, a new voice interrupted. Everyone turned to see Chief Engineer Marcus Rodriguez standing in the doorway, his dark features set in determination. But if you try to interfere with his fever, you'll only make things worse. Zwaxtai's exoskeleton chimed softly as he turned. Explain. Rodriguez stepped fully into the medical bay, his experienced eyes scanning the monitoring equipment. This is how humans fight infection. We've evolved this response over millions of years. Trying to stop it now would be like trying to shut down your crystalline regeneration cycle mid-process, sir. The first officer's structure stilled at the comparison. That would be extremely dangerous. Exactly, Rodriguez nodded. Our bodies know what they're doing. The fever will break on its own once it's done its job. Fascinating, Tari murmured, her scales shifting to a curious blue as she made notes. Your entire species has evolved to temporarily sacrifice homeostasis for immune efficiency. Jasper let out a weak chuckle that turned into another cough. That's one way to put it. Dr. Nixis glided forward, her sensor stalks extending toward the chief engineer. You seem quite knowledgeable about this process, Engineer Rodriguez. Would you be willing to share more detailed information about human fever responses? Our medical database is inadequate on this subject. Happy to help, Doc, Rodriguez smiled, pulling up a holographic chair. Though I should warn you, human biology can get pretty weird by galactic standards. We're beginning to understand that, Dr. Nixis replied dryly. Over the next hour, Rodriguez explained the intricacies of human immune responses, while Tari recorded everything and Dr. Nixis asked increasingly specific questions. First Officer ZYXTI remained as well, his initial alarm gradually giving way to fascination. So your bodies deliberately create an inhospitable environment for pathogens, ZYXTI mused, his crystalline structure reflecting the shifting lights of the medical displays. Similar to how we use controlled fracturing to eliminate impurities in our external layers. Something like that, Rodriguez agreed. Though I bet our ancestors never imagined their fever response would cause such a stir on a spaceship. A sudden spike in one of the monitoring alerts drew everyone's attention. Tari rushed to check the readings, her scales cycling through worried colors before settling on a relieved blue. Doctor, his temperature, it's starting to decrease. Dr. Nixis's sensor stalks word as she confirmed the readings. Indeed. It appears the fever has reached its peak and is now beginning to resolve naturally. Told you, it would break, on its own, Jasper mumbled from his blanket cocoon, managing a weak thumbs up. First Officer ZYXTI's exoskeleton chimed thoughtfully. Perhaps we should consider updating our ship's medical protocols to account for these unique aspects of human physiology. Already working on it, sir, Tari assured him, her scales now a confident shade of green as she compiled her notes. Dr. Nixis's outer membrane rippled with satisfaction as she watched her patient's temperature continue its gradual descent. This experience had certainly been educational, if somewhat alarming. She made a mental note to request more detailed information about human medical conditions from Earth's databases. Something told her this wouldn't be the last time human biology surprised them. Natural recovery. 24 hours after the fever's peak, the medical bay of the Stellaris had returned to its usual serene state. The frantic array of monitoring equipment had been reduced to a single diagnostic panel, which showed Jasper's temperature holding steady at a normal 37 degrees Celsius. Well, that was exciting, Jasper said, sitting up and stretching. His color had returned to normal, though dark circles under his eyes betrayed his lingering fatigue. Can I go back to my quarters now, Doc? Dr. Nixis's sensor stalks performed one final scan before she responded. Your vital signs have stabilized, and the pathogen levels in your system are negligible. However, I would appreciate it if you would permit me to conduct one more comprehensive scan for my research. Jasper exchanged an amused glance with Tari, whose scales had maintained a peaceful azure since his temperature had normalized. You've probably collected enough data to write a book by now. 3 research papers, actually, Tari chimed in, pulling up her data tablet. Dr. Nixis has already submitted preliminary findings to the Galactic Medical Council. Your fever has caused quite a stir in xenobiology circles. Wonderful, Jasper groaned. I'm going to be famous for having a cold. The medical bay doors whispered open, admitting Lieutenant Wade and Chief Engineer Rodriguez. How's our walking autoclave doing? Rodriguez asked with a grin. Fully cooled down and ready to get back to work, Jasper replied, swinging his legs over the side of the examination platform. Not so fast, Dr. Nixis interjected, her membrane displaying patterns of medical authority. While your fever has resolved, your body has expended significant resources. I am prescribing 24 hours of rest and increased nutrient intake. Wade laughed at Jasper's disappointed expression. Don't argue with the doctor, especially one who's just had a crash course in human biology. Besides, engineering has survived without you for this long. Indeed, a crystalline voice added as First Officer Zyxtai entered the medical bay. Though I must admit, the experience has been educational for all of us. The First Officer's exoskeleton caught the light as he approached Jasper's platform. Engineer Harrison, I owe you an apology. My initial reaction to your condition was overly cautious. I failed to appreciate the sophistication of human biological responses. No offense taken, sir, Jasper assured him. I imagine if I saw one of your crew members deliberately raising their core temperature, I'd be concerned too. The incident has prompted a complete review of our medical protocols, Zyxtai continued, turning to Dr. Nixis. Doctor, your research team's findings will be instrumental in updating our understanding of human crew members' needs. Dr. Nixis's sensor stalks bobbed in acknowledgement. We've already begun compiling a comprehensive database of human medical responses. Tari has been particularly thorough in documenting the fever process. Tari's scales flushed a modest pink. The temporal progression was fascinating. The way the human immune system coordinates with thermal regulation to create an orchestrated response, it's really quite elegant. Elegant? Jasper coughed out a laugh. I spent 2 days feeling like I was being cooked from the inside out. Yet your cellular structure remained intact, and the pathogen was eliminated with minimal lasting damage, Dr. Nixis observed. Your species has evolved a remarkably effective defense mechanism. Rodriguez stepped forward, placing a sympathetic hand on Jasper's shoulder. Just wait until they discover how humans heal broken bones. Their minds will really be blown then. Dr. Nixis's sensor stalk snapped to attention. Your skeletal system has special healing properties as well. Oh no, Jasper groaned, flopping back onto the examination platform. Now you've done it. The medical bay filled with laughter, human chuckles mixing with the crystalline chimes of Zyxtai's amusement and the harmonic tones of Dr. Nixis's and Tari's mirth. It was a moment that perfectly encapsulated the growing understanding between the species. As the laughter subsided, Dr. Nixis made a few final adjustments to Jasper's medical file. You are cleared to return to your quarters, Engineer Harrison. Though I would appreciate it if you would consider allowing us to document any future illnesses you may experience. As long as you promise not to turn me into a research project every time I sneeze, Jasper replied, standing up carefully. No promises, Tari quipped, her scales rippling with amusement. You humans are just too interesting to ignore. As the group began to disperse, Dr. Nixis found herself reflecting on how this simple case of a human fever had affected her entire medical team. They had begun the experience with alarm and confusion, but were ending it with a deeper appreciation for the diversity of life in the galaxy. The story continues in Part 5, where the crew reflects on their newfound understanding and its implications for future human-alien medical cooperation. New understanding. 2 weeks after what the crew had begun calling the fever incident, Dr. Nixis stood before the assembled medical staff of the Stellaris, her sensor stalks extended with pride as she presented her findings. The medical bay's main conference area had been transformed into a lecture hall, with holographic displays showing detailed analyses of human immune responses. As you can see, she indicated a rotating 3D model of human cellular structure. Their proteins demonstrate remarkable heat tolerance. This adaptation allows them to maintain cellular integrity even during periods of significant temperature elevation. In the audience, Tari's scales shifted through scholarly shades of blue as she added notes to the presentation. The young medic had become something of an expert on human biology since documenting Jasper's fever, and her research paper on human thermal regulation had already been accepted by 3 prestigious xenobiology journals. Furthermore, Dr. Nixis continued, this discovery has led us to reconsider many of our assumptions about biological resilience. The human ability to temporarily sacrifice homeostasis for immune efficiency suggests possibilities we had never considered in xenomedicine. The presentation was interrupted by a familiar sneeze from the back of the room. Every alien head turned to see Jasper Harrison leaning against the doorway, a sheepish grin on his face. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, waving off the concerned looks from the medical staff. "Just some dust in engineering. Not another fever, I promise." Dr. Nixis's membrane rippled with what the crew had learned to recognize as amusement. "Engineer Harrison, your timing is impeccable. We were just discussing the implications of your recent illness for interspecies medical protocols. Glad my misery could advance medical science," Jasper chuckled, stepping into the room. "Though I have to admit, it's nice not being treated like a walking biohazard anymore." First Officer Zyxtai, who had been observing from a crystalline seat near the front, chimed thoughtfully. "Indeed. Your experience has prompted several updates to our ship's environmental systems. We've adjusted our biocontainment protocols to account for the unique aspects of human biology. The Galactic Medical Council was particularly interested in our findings," Tari added, her scales flushing with professional pride. "They're recommending that all ships with human crew members update their medical databases." Speaking of updates, Lieutenant Wade called from her position by the main display, "Wait until they hear about human tissue regeneration. Dr. Nixis, did you know our liver can actually regrow itself?" The doctor's sensor stalks froze mid-wave. "Regrow? Without artificial intervention?" "Oh no," Jasper groaned. "Here we go again." But the mood in the room was light, filled with the shared excitement of discovery rather than the fear and confusion of 2 weeks ago. Chief Engineer Rodriguez, who had slipped in behind Jasper, moved to stand beside the diagnostic displays. "You know," he mused, "when humanity first joined the galactic community, we were so focused on learning about alien biology that we never stopped to think how strange we might seem to everyone else." "Strange is not the word I would use," Dr. Nixis replied, her sensor stalks weaving a pattern of scientific enthusiasm. "Fascinating would be more accurate. Your species continues to challenge our understanding of biological possibilities." "Indeed," First Officer Zyxtai agreed, his crystalline structure catching the light as he stood. "Though perhaps we should establish some guidelines for future medical research. We cannot have the entire medical staff dropping everything every time a human crew member catches a cold." "Spoilsport," Tari muttered, her scales flickering with suppressed amusement. As the presentation concluded and the medical staff began to disperse, Dr. Nixis found herself reviewing the events of the past 2 weeks. What had started as a routine medical incident had evolved into something much more significant, a deeper understanding between species, a breaking down of assumptions, and a reminder that the galaxy still held countless surprises. "Doctor," Jasper called as he turned to leave, "just promise me one thing." Her sensor stalks turned toward him inquisitively. "Next time I get sick, try to remember I'm not actually dying." The constant monitoring was worse than the fever. Dr. Nixis's membrane rippled with what might have been embarrassment. "I make no promises, Engineer Harrison. After all, who knows what other fascinating biological processes you humans might demonstrate." The medical bay filled with laughter once again, human, crystalline, and harmonic all blending together in a symphony of shared understanding. As the sound faded, Dr. Nixis turned back to her research notes. There was still so much to learn about their human crew members, but at least now they knew that sometimes, the best medicine was simply to let nature take its course. Even if that course involved temporarily cooking pathogens to death. The end.